Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. I have the unique ability to not only remember so many events of my personal life since the age of 7, but also from my studied memory of USA and world history and sports history. I remember thousands of events and dates, and I often like to share these with people and also stories, unusual stories, uh, to share with people. And sometimes I'll ask a person what their birthday is, and I can almost always tell them something famous from history that happened on that day without looking at any notes or book or any kind of reference in front of me, as well as often something from my personal life. It could be a trip to Europe I took some years ago, or some events. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, events around Baltimore, the state of Maryland, my travels to other parts of the United States, and when I lived in Boston briefly back in 1975, 76. It all depends what day a person selects or what year. I've memorized many things in my own personal life as well as USA world history, sports history, and other information. Well, tonight I call this Amazing Stories tonight. I will share a number of events of my life and also a few events from history uh, towards the end of our program tonight. Um, One of the unusual things that happened early in my life was back in 1968. Um, Now, I know a story about crime is not usually funny at all, and we have so much types of crime in the United States and other countries too, street crimes and other types of crime. But this story is just a bit of a funny ending, I think, how this turned out. And this happened on the night of August 28th, 1968. I was 15 years old, 2 months short of 16, and I lived in downtown Baltimore. And the few other boys who lived in my neighborhood with their families, we had to improvise games, not like many people growing up in the suburbs and small towns who have nice big fields to play their sports. We had to improvise on a parking lot that was close to the Walters Art Gallery in downtown Baltimore. And we played a type of baseball where we used a rubber ball, and we played touch football there for a number of years in the 1960s. So on this particular evening, August 28th, 1968, again I was 15 and my three buddies were 13 years old each. And we're playing baseball around 7 o'clock in the evening, and we hear a lady scream for help. She was at a bus stop, and she was waiting there for a bus, but these two men attacked her, and one took her purse, her pocketbook, and was running down the street from the parking lot area. So I said to my friends very quickly, I think we need to try to get him. This is a terrible thing, So we threw our bats and the gloves and the ball down, and we, all four of us ran after him. And it was several blocks away when we confronted him and surrounded him, even though he was bigger than any of us, but there were four of us, and we brought him to the ground, making a citizen's arrest, effectively speaking. And my friend Dwight always carried a pair of handcuffs with him. He pretended like he was a little policeman or police detective or something. And somebody nearby in an apartment heard what was happening. They looked out the window and they telephoned the police. Of course, people didn't have cell phones back then, but still, there was an apartment nearby and somebody saw what was happening. They telephoned the police. And sure enough, would you believe, we turned this guy over to the police already handcuffed. They couldn't believe it, that four teenage boys could really did this, It sounds like something from a movie, maybe some type of comedy movie set in a bigger city like New York, Chicago, LA or something. Maybe it was some actor like John Belushi years ago or something, some of those people from Saturday Night Live, or it sounds like just a funny made-up story, but this actually happened. Now, I don't see those three guys anymore. I haven't seen them for about 50 years, but if I ever ran into one of them again, I might say, Ennis, Johnny, Dwight, do you remember that event that happened in 1968 where we made a citizen's arrest of a criminal and turned him over to the police already handcuffed? I bet they would remember. It's such an unusual story. But would they remember August 28th, 1968, is my point. The combination day, month, and year, 54 years later. Probably not. Well, a few months later, in March of 1969, we were invited down to the War Memorial Building in Baltimore with our families, and we were given certificates of honor from the Baltimore City Police Department, which, of course, we were very proud of, and our families were too, of course. And I remember that was March 25th, 1969, when we were given those awards for what happened in August of 68. A very exciting week for me, because just 3 days after that, on March 28th, I was in a high school track meet. I just became a runner in 1968, and I ran cross country that year, my junior year in high school, and now the spring of 69, and I was in a 1 mile race against 5 other boys. There were 3 from my school and 3 from the other school. And that 1 mile race, after 3 laps of a 4-lap race, I was only in 4th place. 3 boys were ahead of me. But in that final lap, like the title of a wonderful movie that came out years ago, which has become my favorite movie of all time, I ran like a chariot of fire, and I passed all 3 boys and won the race. And then that night, I went out with a number of my friends. There were 4 guys and 3 girls, and the seven of us went to see an ice hockey game in Baltimore. It was a very exciting, personally happy day. However, I did hear on the news that same day, former President Eisenhower died that day in March 28th, 1969. And even then, I'd studied World War II history better than many other 16-year-olds, and so I was sorry to hear that. Of course, a former president, and he was a great general during World War II. He was the commander of the famous D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944. So he died that day, but I say in my own personal life, it was a good day. And then the next day, March 29th, my mom and I flew to England, my first trip to England, a 2-week trip. That was my first airplane ride ever. So within a few days here, March 25th, winning that certificate for what happened the year before, and then winning a race, a 1 mile race, first time I ever won a contest, a sports contest, and then my first airplane ride ever. All that, so close together. A memorable week. Now in 1972, my mom and I went to the famous Munich Olympic Games. We were there just for the last 4 or 5 days, and the games lasted, most Olympics last about 16 days, but that was actually 17 because of the terrible tragedy of the Israeli athletes that were murdered on September 5th and 6th. 2 were killed on the 5th, and then after midnight at the airport near Munich, the other 9 were killed by the terrorists when they pulled hand grenades and fired back at the police officers too. And there was 1 German police officer died, and the 11 Israeli athletes. So 12 innocent people died. And to think at that very time, my mom and I were on a train. We left from Copenhagen, Denmark. We had flown to Copenhagen from New York a few days before, and we were on the train the night of September 5th, and then arriving in Munich morning of September 6th. Just hours after that concluded, and it was quite a shock. You can imagine going to the Olympic City, looking forward to the sports and meeting people in friendship and all, and then suddenly this horrible event happened. Never had there been murders in the history of the Olympic Games at any Olympics. Not just modern, that goes back to ancient Greece, at least during the time period of the Olympics. Despite all the wars they had in Greece, at least during the time period, there was a special Olympic truce that the people would stop fighting between the various city-states of Greece, Athens, Sparta, and other cities. So this was just awful. First time ever people murdered at the Olympic Games. And it's just kind of strange that we had, it wasn't like we were in Munich for the whole 2 weeks already there for all these sports, but we were just arriving arbitrarily. It happened to be the second of those 2 days where that terrible incident happened. And just recently, I recorded a YouTube story specifically about the 1972 Munich Olympics, which you can also find on my channel, Phil Easter, The Amazing Memory Man, among other stories. 1972, though, turned out to be, it's a fascinating year for me for a number of reasons. Earlier that year, on April 17th, I ran the famous Boston Marathon for the first of 5 times. I later learned, just in the last year, actually, I learned that the famous actress Jennifer Garner was born that day, April 17th, 1972. So she just turned 50 this year. You can fool me. When you see those Neutrogena commercials on TV, I tell you, she looks like she's about 28, but she's 50. That's hard to believe. But the beautiful Jennifer Garner was born April 17th, 1972, the day I ran the Boston Marathon the first time, and the first day that women, the first year, women were allowed to run the Boston Marathon officially. They weren't allowed to wear numbers before that, but that year they were, starting in 1972. So I'm kind of happy that, I'm a man, but still I'm glad to say I like women's sports very much, and I'm happy to say that the first time I ever ran the Boston Marathon, women could run officially as well. And later that year, on November 7th, I voted in my first presidential election. First of 13 presidential elections. I've never missed one, every 4 years since 1972. Well, 7 years later, in 1979, I took a long trip to Great Britain and Ireland. 15 weeks I traveled between June 26th, October 10th, 1979. Saw many wonderful places and events. I saw Queen Elizabeth on July 5th on a small island called the Isle of Man. And actually on August 18th, I saw The Who in concert in London, a famous rock band. Actually, I'd seen Wimbledon tennis back on June 28th, just a couple days after I arrived. But when I went to Ireland, the first couple days in Ireland, I arrived on July 18th, and I stayed at one bed and breakfast house for 2 days. Then I had to find another one. They were booked up for the weekend coming up. And I went to the Irish Tourist Board, downtown Dublin. Someone recommended they could help you find bed and breakfast houses and stay with other families. Well, I got the name and address of one lady who owned a bed and breakfast house. When I got there, she said, "I'm sorry, I'm full up. They must have made a mistake at the tourist board. But I can recommend a lady who lives close by, Mrs. O'Leary. And she's not officially listed with the Irish Tourist Board, but she does take people. And you give her my name, and I think she will take you." So I walked to her house just a few blocks away. I knocked on the door, and she looks at me and says, "Well, I don't usually take residents without recommendations." And I said, "Well, this lady down the street said I could stay, if you have an opening, please. I'm looking for a place." And she looked at me and said, "Well, you look nice enough, laddie. Come on in." So that was nice. But what happened the next day was very odd indeed, because that night when I went up to bed, and Mrs. O'Leary said to me, "Well, the only other people staying here right now are an American couple on their honeymoon. Come down to breakfast in the morning. Perhaps you know them." I was thinking to myself, well, the chance I would know someone, I didn't really know anyone that I knew from Baltimore or anywhere else in America that would be going to Ireland then. I went up to bed thinking, yeah, well, okay, it's like 300-some million people in America, Mrs. O'Leary, and there's several thousand bed and breakfast houses in Ireland. Like, what's the chance I'm going to meet somebody I know, even slightly? Come on. Maybe you had too many pints of Guinness or something. I was thinking to myself. Well, next morning I come down to breakfast. I say hello to Peter and Allison. They're from the state of New Jersey. Their last name was Sheehan. So Peter and Allison Sheehan. And we're talking a little while, and Peter looks at me and says, "I have seen you somewhere before." I say, "Well, really? Let's see now." You're from New Jersey. Excuse me, I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, well, maybe you saw me run the New York City Marathon a couple years ago in 1976. He said, no, I did not, that's not it. But because I mentioned my interest in running, he said, my father is George Sheehan, Dr. George Sheehan. And you know, he's written books on running. I said, well, yes, I do know. I have one of his 2 books. I already had that back in Baltimore, one of the 2 books. So that alone was interesting to find that out, that even though Peter did not run himself, his father was the famous running doctor of the 1970s, George Sheehan, and I had one of his books. But then Peter said, again, I've seen you somewhere before. Would you believe we figured out he did go to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore 2 years before, in 1977, I was just taking a part-time course 1 night a week. He was a full-time student about to graduate. We had a beer together at a bar called the Rathskeller on the campus of Johns Hopkins University, and now 2 years later, at the same bed and breakfast house in Ireland. I mean, that is just incredible. It must be astronomical odds, several billion to 1 against that ever happening, yet it happened. So, you know, I didn't know him well, of course, but still, I met him 1 time before. Well, I guess the moral of the story is never underestimate the wisdom of an Irish lady that owns a bed and breakfast house. I mean, really, just something else, how that happened. Something interesting in Baltimore happened in 1982. I remember it was June 21st, 1982 in particular. I was downtown, walking downtown on an errand not far from where we lived, and I saw, unfortunately, a man on the ground who needed medical help, obviously. He might have been homeless, I'm not sure, but some people were gathered around him. And then I walked a few blocks over and I heard an ambulance coming, so most likely for him. The siren, you know, it's a perfectly sunny day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not rain, not cloudy, sunny day, and the ambulance is coming in that direction. And I couldn't believe what I saw next. The only time in my life I've ever actually seen a car accident in front of my eyes. You know, sometimes you might hear something and you turn and look a few seconds afterwards. But I just couldn't believe this. A car ran into the ambulance. How horrible. What excuse would that driver have? Especially on a bright sunny day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a car slammed into the ambulance. So, well, they'd have to get another ambulance indeed and I wondered if those men inside the ambulance were injured, you know? I stayed a while and I told the police what I saw, and they took my name and phone number and all and address. They said, well, the court might summon you at some point to a trial, you know, a traffic court situation trial. And sure enough, would you believe the driver of that car was none other than a local politician. He was a member of the Maryland State Senate in Annapolis. I mean, isn't that disgusting? You talk about, as they say, the politicians running or driving all over us. I mean, really. I mean, it's literally, he drove into an ambulance, and that is just inexcusable. And that was June 21st, 1982. Well, that night when I came home watching television news, the very same day in England that Princess Diana gave birth to her first child, William, who may someday be king. As you know, Prince Charles is next in line to Queen Elizabeth, and then William and Harry, 2 popular brothers now, but William is older, so he's next in line. I think he married a lady named Kate Middleton a few years ago. Yes, so that's the very day something famous in the world happened. Again, when something in my own life I saw was very unusual. And this has happened a number of times in my life. 1984, June 14th, 1984, I'm walking near the Washington Monument in downtown Baltimore, where I lived at the time. I noticed a little bit of money on the ground. I said, oh, not just $1 either, because you sometimes see $1. You know, I looked down, I picked it up. It was $14. a $10 bill, and 4 ones. And the strange thing about that was, you think if somebody would drop money, it would be scattered a little bit as a person walks, but it was so neatly arranged. $14 on June 14th. Isn't that strange to find the exact amount of money on the date of a month? Other than the first, that wouldn't be so amazing, just $1 in the first of the month. But to find $14 on June 14th, that just seems strange. And it was like just so neatly arranged, almost as somebody put it there. So I didn't feel bad taking it because there was no wallet, no one's name there. I would not, I'd feel honored, bound to turn it in if there was a name of a person, a wallet or something. It was just $14 right there. Later that year, I took a trip to Canada in September. And before leaving Baltimore, I heard in the news that a new prime minister was elected in Canada by the name of Brian Mulroney. He was elected in early September. And so a couple of days later, I flew from Baltimore to Ottawa, Canada, the capital city. And my first full day, the next day I slept that night, the next day, the first full day in Canada, I was out for a short run, just for exercise. I was near the Houses of Parliament, and I noticed a crowd gathering. I wondered, what's this all about? I walked over there, and sure enough, it was people shaking hands with the new Prime Minister of Canada. So I just walked up and said hello briefly and shook hands with him. I was just dressed in a shorts and a t-shirt, not very dignified. I was out for a run, but I thought that was neat how I could meet a new Prime Minister of a country just a couple of days after he took office. In 1985 was a very special event in my life. Here in Baltimore, as I say, I lived in downtown area for years near the Washington Monument, the oldest George Washington monument in the United States, about half a century older than the more famous one of the District of Columbia. And the one we have here in Baltimore has a very nice statue of George on the top. It's not just like a pyramid like the one in D.C. It's a real nice statue, actually, of George Washington. Well, I knew already his birthday and death dates and some important events of his life. And indeed, on the monument, there are a number of events of his life listed there, combination day, month, and year. But on April 29th, 1985, I was walking by the monument about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I looked over to supposedly the correct inauguration date. It says 4 March 1789. The only thing is, he became president April 30th, 1789, not March 4th. And this is, I just wrote down here in this paper to show you this is how it's listed. They like to list it the day first, the month, okay, Old English style. So it says 4 March 1789. It should read 30 April 1789. So even though the year is correct, but the day and month is still wrong. Therefore, it's wrong. If they care to be exact, then you should get the exact date. The only time in American history a president was inaugurated April 30th. Now, 4 years later, in 1793, his second inauguration was on March 4th. Second, but not in 1789. So they sort of put this got the second date on the first year, but they shouldn't have made that mistake even. It was built between 1815 and 1829, not long after he lived. He died in 1799. I'm sure there are many people still living then, the builders and architects of the monument, who knew the events of his life, and they should not have gotten that wrong. And it was on that monument ever since the 1830s. They put the inscriptions up, and I noticed this on April 29th, 1985. And so I called the Evening Sun newspaper that very evening, and sure enough, they decided to do a story about my discovery of the monumental error. How I used my memory for something very important in local history. And on July 8th, 1985, I'm proud to say I made front page news of the Evening Sun in Baltimore, an article about me right below President Reagan, who was the president at the time. And presidents have articles all the time, so that was a good placement in the newspaper to have an article right under President Reagan. It was titled, "Oh My God, It's Wrong, Monumental Error in the City." Those are my exact words when I noticed it. Oh my God, it's wrong. I mean, I've seen many books and magazines, many mistakes in books and magazines, and newspapers, and on TV and radio news, but on a monument, especially to the first president of the United States, that's pretty bad. And the city has still not changed that, even though some people back then who worked for the Department of Recreation and Parks in Baltimore said they would, reported by the Sun that many years ago in 1985. In any event, it led me to have several radio and TV interviews coming out of that. And in those cases, I also used examples of my overall memory talent for these different subjects, but they first interviewed me about how I discovered that mistake, a very important local event to notice a mistake on a monument to the first president of the United States. And now, what happened just a few years ago is also very special. In 2016, I was listening to a local public radio station here in Baltimore, WJHU. It was called at one time WJHU, and actually now it's called WYPR radio. I was on there twice, actually. Once when it was WJHU in 1996, July 17th, 1996. I was interviewed by a reporter about women in the Olympics, because unlike many men who only study men's sports, I've studied women's sports a lot too. And that was 2 days before the Atlanta Olympics began in 1996. So on July 17th that year, I was interviewed on that subject. And then sometime around 2004 or 5, they changed the name to WYPR, but the same station. And then I was on August 16th, 2010, with a reporter named Dan Rodricks, who also works for the Sun papers, and he interviewed me on my overall memory talent. He referred to me as the amazing memory man of Baltimore. So I was his guest for 1 hour, and that was great fun as we listed examples of dates and things, and then people called in telephone with their birthday, and I could almost always tell them something famous that happened. But I always wanted to do something for medical science research. And I telephoned somebody at Johns Hopkins in 2015. I didn't know what department would be interested. I just took a chance one day, and whatever department I called said they weren't interested in studying anybody with great memory ability. But it's kind of hard to explain on telephone in a short conversation all about me. It's impossible, you know. You have to see me at length or meet me and see me a number of times. Well, it just so happened on March 2nd, 2016, I'm listening to WYPR, their noon hour, the same show I was on twice before, time period. And this time as a woman hostess, Dan Rodgers no longer worked there. A woman was interviewing a doctor from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And one of the topics was he helps people with memory problems, memory illness, or people who've been in accidents, and helps them. So I was listening to this and I thought, I wonder if I should call in. I mean, I've often telephoned radio shows too. I've been a special guest 6 times in my life, but also over 100 times I've called in, to give an opinion or observation or something. And I thought, well, maybe I should. Then I changed my mind after a few minutes. I said, no, maybe it would sound like I'm showboating a little bit to say I have a great memory talent. But then I thought, well, maybe I still should. It's funny, I vacillated. But fortunately, I got through at 5 minutes before 1 o'clock. And the lady producer said, sir, you have to be quick. You're the last caller. And sure enough, in about 2 minutes, apparently I explained enough that Dr. Jason Brandt said, I'd like to meet Phil. So I said, could you take my phone number off the air, please, very quickly? I know your show's about to end. And they did. And the very next day, on March 3rd, he telephoned me and said, Mr. Easter, you won't believe this. I heard you on the radio a few years ago, meaning in 2010, 6 years before, when I was interviewed by Dan Rodgers. He heard me that day and wanted to get my contact information, but the station wouldn't give it to him. Somehow, because, and it's so odd how that would happen. Then I'm listening to him speaking and just want to contribute to memory. and he's invited me to do this special research for the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in 2016 and 17. So I went over there a number of times. They gave me some tests and just all sorts of different things. And it was very interesting. And the bottom line is I have contributed to medical research science as a single case study, which is pretty rare in medical history in the whole world. Usually studies are in groups of people, many people. And I'm proud to say it was a single case study in medical science research on memory, even though it was like 64, 65, 2016, 2017. And I'm very fortunate that despite having a stroke just a few years ago on December 30th, 2019, and being in a hospital and nursing home for some months after that, coming back on March 11th, 2020 to my house, I'm physically having problems, but at least I still have a great memory talent, and I'm so happy that I can share with other people. And 4 years in a row, between 2016 and 19, the other doctor who did the study with Dr. Brandt, Arnold Bacher, PhD, teaches a course at Johns Hopkins University called The Neuroscience of Learning and Memory every spring semester. And for 4 years in a row, I was his special guest for one day towards the end of his semester to share with the young students who are all going on to medical school. And I share stories with them and usually tell them about their birth date, something famous that happened. But of course, in 2020 and 21, we couldn't do this because of the pandemic. But this year, we could do it again. And so on April 26th, I went over there for the first time in 3 years before everything, so to speak, meaning pandemic and what happened to me, all coinciding the same time period. So it's very worthwhile and grateful that I could do this again this year to share with people. Well, as the great CBS television newsman said back in the 1950s, when he would finish his broadcast, he would say to people, good night and good luck.